it's not a zero-sum game. The more power that you devolve out to the employees and the staff who really need it, who need to have ownership over what they're doing, the more the sum total of power is in an organization.
Welcome to this space of conversations with game changers.
To make meaningful conversations with those who we have found are connected to their purpose from within, who are able to express that purpose in a really unique way, and through that are bringing transformation to the world in different ways.
We are interested in people who aim to change the game and create new narratives that open new possibilities for them and for all of us.
We are Purpose+Motion, and we support organizations to connect with their purpose and then get in motion, in action.
The potential we help them unlock allows them to stabilize through transitions, create healthier work environments, and scale their positive impact in the world.
Enjoy these conversations.
And please let us know what you think in the comments below.
And today I'm really glad to present to you Kelso. Thank you very much for being with us, Casey.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And so, Casey, you're a strategist at heart, I hear. So really focusing on campaigning, advocacy, organizing, and communications, having worked in in some of the large INGOs, so international non-governmental organizations like International Crisis Group, Transparency International, Amnesty International, but also journalism and sort of on the ground, also Peace Corps, I believe.
Yeah.
So quite a varied experience there. Educated Princeton and Berkeley in the US. So kind of quite a varied and at the same time coherent INGO kind of profile. And yeah, I guess to dive straight into that, what is it that that little intro doesn't say about you?
It's hard to ask what it doesn't say. I have a long CV because I'm a fairly experienced person, which is a code word for I've been around a long time. The one thing I think that attracted me to join with that whole process of reinventing NGOs was management as well. That when I was at Amnesty International, I was asked to step up into a management position at fairly short notice. And I wasn't sure I really wanted to be a manager at that point in my career. And I felt it was being done so badly. Someone has to do it. And I was not going to watch confusion over roles, double assignments where someone would assign the same task to two different people, didn't say thank you, didn't have just the basic civility to say, did this go well for you, or to check out, or to understand, is this person understanding their role or their assignment that they're supposed to do? So there's a lot of different things I saw that was lacking in management of teams. So I made a decision. So the one thing you don't see there, I do like doing advocacy. I enjoy doing media work. I learn all the time more about distributed campaigning and use of volunteers and digital. But at the heart as well, what's interesting for me in this process has been management, that there is a mutual accountability between managers and the employees that isn't recognized, and sometimes if it goes unnoticed or unacknowledged, then a lot of the tensions go subterranean, and there's tensions in an organization. You can't put your finger on it. But that sort of importance of doing the right thing in managing people and getting the best out of your team, that's one of the things that I think that I'm feeling passionate about as well, in addition to advocacy and campaigning.
That's really interesting. And I was reading through the article that the blog post that you submitted, I think, to the Open Democracy site, and
yeah,
it's really, really interesting for me. That really sprung out was this feeling you were expressing that organizations really need that coherence between their internal way of functioning and the external ideals. And this is something we also have found in many of our bits of work, is that that's so difficult for organizations to do. And I mean, I guess the question for me is, you having been in many of these management roles or also in many of these organizations, why do you feel that's so difficult for organizations to achieve?
I think there's a couple of reasons, actually. One is I've worked with a number of different communications directors that are very switched on about external representation, but there's no internal communications. There's not an internal communications director, and it sort of is a stepchild to trying to do their work. And rightly so, if you're concerned about branding, you're concerned about public reputation, but nobody thinks about internal reputation and what's happening inside the organization when there's layoffs and redundancies, or if there's a difficulty by one of the country offices. It impacts everyone, and it's going around on the intranet or on Slack or on personal email or in the lunchroom. And that internal communication actually influences exactly how the staff represent themselves externally. I guess also that I think sometimes as well that communications function is underrated or undervalued, that in talking about branding, from the research perspective, because I was once deputy director for research at Amnesty as well, and a researcher, I think people say, that's the white boy, slick sort of thing. I don't want to have to deal with advertising and branding. At its essence, however, branding is the values of your organization and how you put that across. And whether it's in a media interview or a government discussion that you open up those first 30 seconds to a minute, who are you? What does your organization represent? You have 30 seconds to say what you mean. And if you don't have a clear idea about what you stand for, what your values are, why you're doing this work, what sort of outcome is going to come from this meeting, people sense it immediately and think, technocrat, or, oh, it's an analyst that's come in to make money off of my information. Screw you, I'm not going to say anything at all. And they'll sort of
crunch up.
Crunch up and say, I don't have to really answer your questions, forget it.
Yeah.
And it could be a government person as well. So the opposite is when you are very clear about your values and your branding, and you don't think of it as something separate from the rest of what you're doing. You say, I am doing this because I'm talking to all parties, and in particular with you, I understand that the concerns that you have about your community or your country that's getting a raw deal. And I understand that. And I just want to hear, what would you want me to present to these high profile decision makers back in Brussels at the EU or at the United Nations? And then people can figure, well, maybe this guy can do something for me and my values. So you connect on a values basis. And I think that many people don't really recognize that that's what's going on. It's not about the facts, and it's not about a slick slogan. It's about the values that you're conveying in the way that you talk, and the sort of visuals or the examples that you use, or that first 30 seconds that you do. So.
I really like that. And I like what you said, that people can sense when that's not true. It's not even that they understand sort of intellectually, it's that they get, and it's this nearly whether you really embody those values that you're speaking about, that it's really part of how you live in your organization, how you work. Or is it just, as you say, a slick slogan, right?
Well, or something that you're supposed to say because that's what you're paid to do.
Yeah.
So what I find really frustrating as well, what makes me passionate about it is I've watched young staff members come into an organization, or I would go to a G20 meeting, and you could tell that that Minister of Foreign Affairs did not believe a damn in what he was talking about with human rights and the rights of indigenous people or the vulnerable and people who are at risk. He doesn't give a shit. He's there because he's been pushed by his party. It's part of the party apparatus. And so immediately, you can tell. And on the opposite side, I've been at a UN conference where you can see someone really catch fire and you think, oh, they actually believe it. Wow, I want to talk to that person. And suddenly you see they become magnetized, that there's, after the coffee break, you can see people just rush to that person and say, I want to hear more. I want to hear more, or bask more in your passion and your enthusiasm. Can you tell me what's going on? And it could be a prime minister or secretary, like a cabinet secretary or someone middle level. But if they have that passion, you can immediately understand it and respect it.
Absolutely, and I mean that's really what we love to look for, but also help people bring out. You know, is that passion about your work, of course, but also this is what these conversations are about changing the game, right? About making change happen on an individual, organizational, but also on a systemic level, which is what this whole process is that we're working on, right?
Yeah.
Together. And I guess for me, I hear in you that passion, and yes, it's about management, it's about communication, but what is it like, say, in the last few months or years that you felt really passionate about seeing change in this sector, in this way that work is being done? What would you love to see change?
In the way that it's being done, I think, as I say, there's a couple of things. One was, I can recall I was the senior person on the delegation to the Copenhagen Summit of 2019, the climate summit. That was the, if you want to call it like the Hackney phrase, the tipping point. That was the moment of truth where our government's going to step up and do the right thing or not. They didn't. We failed. Greenpeace, Amnesty, CAN, the Climate Action Network that was composed of maybe 80 different organizations that were all working together. We didn't make it work. And in part it was because, this the strategy side, they didn't do their research correctly. They didn't know what the Japanese were thinking. They had no idea why was Obama not there. Obama came in very late. What was happening? Where was the president and what was the United States position? So there was not a lot of forethought or research that went into it. They weren't serious about trying to ground the strategy and what was going on. There was some monitoring real time there, but there was no prep work beforehand. So at a UN convention is not the time when you want to do your lobbying. It's actually 6 months before, to make sure that people arrive at the site with the right position, and you put enough pressure that they get they have a right policy that's going to carry through. And without having had that smart strategy, we lost big. And I think the environmental movement and a lot of the NGOs that were there have been only trying to catch up or trying to get smarter and faster and more political after that. So I think that was one of the things that I felt passionate about, was to see the importance of stakeholder analysis and understanding who you're talking to, how you frame your messages, and doing that research proper so that you know what are the most important messages that they need to hear and what can actually change them upstream before you get to that decision-making process.
Yeah. And I also really like what you were saying in the article you wrote about how on the internal level, there's also a need for real, not just reforms, but nearly a complete shift in the way that organizations are running, and bringing in more diversity, bringing in more, obviously what we're seeing today in the world with all the conversations around race, around in the last few years around gender. What do you think is needed in this sector for that to really go further enough, be at a level which is acceptable, really, and that your system is in a healthy place?
What I've enjoyed about the discussions is the push by some of the members of our little community that we've been working on in reinventing and international NGOs to try to get grounded in the actual people on whose behalf or with whom you are working. So trying to connect more solidly to communities. In that, you need to make sure that you actually are speaking about things that matter to people. So when you mentioned transformational approaches, game changers that are trying to do transformational things, it is inherent in trying to do things differently that you work out a way in which it's going to spread that people actually will agree with you. If one of my big things, as you've heard, is, as I said, is the changing management practice. If you want to get those people on board, then I have seen the INGO Charter. I was part of it years ago when it first started, the International Advocacy NGO Charter, trying to establish standards, codes of conduct There's a new group that's taking it over, Accountable Now, who have a global standard that they try to put out there as well. That Amnesty, Save the Children, I mentioned it in the article, they all signed up to it. It didn't do any good. As things melted down and they had the Me Too movement came up, and they found that there was sexual harassment by the CEO and the policy director at Save the Children, or someone was driven to suicide. 2 people were driven to suicide at Amnesty International. Those kind of charters or codes of conduct didn't take root. In them of themselves, they're great, but that transformational element means that you have to connect on it on a personal level. So going back to the idea on gender issues, if the personal is political, then you have to figure out how you're going to make this a personal challenge, a personal transformation for that person and how they do their work. Never mind the CEO or the senior management team or waiting for the strategic policy to come out, the 5-year plan. You have to figure out how you're going to do it for yourself and those around you and create these small microcosms of integrity that we're all in this together. We're all going to work at the same time to try to transform this. So transformational work, I think, takes a lot of effort. The best I've seen of the codes of conducts and things, one of the things I noticed was Oxfam said in their review, we're going to adopt feminist principles. So I quickly Googled feminist principles, and I found ActionAid had already adopted them in part. Oxfam Canada in particular put them out, a number of different principles that they wanted to live by or work by. And I think that's what's really catching fire, at least inside Oxfam, what I've heard, as well as in ActionAid. It's not feminist principles as it's only for women or for the uplifting of one gender or to become more gender aware. It's really transformed the way that people talk among themselves in a better manner. So you could say that they're just commonsensical principles if you want, but it means not talking on behalf of someone else without consultation. It means respecting other views and not automatically waiting, aggressive listening. So instead of active listening, you're aggressively listening for that pause so you can jump in and with your own point. It means you actually have to stop trying to push your own point or your own perspective and try to listen to the other person's side and find some halfway point, even if you don't like it. It's not about being the winner. It's about co-winning, co-creation, co-directing an initiative to make sure that everyone has a feeling that they are bought in, they've expressed themselves, and they are able to see themselves in the project. And in small teams, that's the one thing. It gets into a larger organization. So when I ran my own NGO in London, there was a difference between personal and positional authority. In a small office, positional authority didn't work. I was the coordinator, the CEO. I could tell people what to do, but it was on a personal basis. They actually believed I thought through it, and I persuaded people this is the best way because of this, this, and this. And if they had objections, I'd listen and be able to answer them, but it was positional. In larger international NGOs, that doesn't, sometimes people forget that. They work on position. I am the Secretary General. I am the manager, the head of communications. You're going to do what I tell you because I paid a lot of money. This is my position. I have the authority to make it happen, and I don't have any budget for what your idea is. And I think that's where things go wrong. So in terms of transformation, I think that's those feminist principles really bring it back to discussion, negotiated agreement, consultation, leadership that doesn't have to be a bullying leadership, but is inclusive enough to hear other viewpoints as well. So
yeah, and that's
there's
really,
my sermon.
and that's really interesting for me. I mean, I look at us too, right? We're 2 white men, and we are in essence, you know, the sort of privileged, also having had management roles and so on, privileged holders of power in many ways. That in many ways, as you say, that transformation needs to be personal. Of all the people, we are probably the ones who need, you know, representatives at least of those who need to change the most. And I really like that idea of those feminist principles. And I wonder, in your experience, like, what have been the most transformative moments for you in your work as a white male, quite in the upper edges of the power dynamics, that made you see things differently, or that transformed the way you saw your role in being able to create social transformation, change for others?
I have to say there's been a number of different missteps in my career that I've had to learn from my mistakes, or moments where I saw things in a different perspective because I hadn't really considered it, and it caught me out of the blue, a Zen moment of insight. One of them was when I think leading a child rights NGO was one thing that suddenly I understood from our Southern members in the Philippines, or from those in Latin America that were dealing with kids, that the kids had a right to speak. That in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there is an article in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that says they should be allowed to help to co-determine what happens to them. If you're under 18, it doesn't mean that you're an imbecile or that you're a puppet to be moved around. It's whatever's in the best interest of that child, and the child should be able to articulate that. So that was one of the first ones, was before we set our strategy at my NGO, I had to go out in the Philippines. They moved it down in a very dangerous moment at the time in southern Mindanao. And we talked to former child soldiers about what they needed, or actually a few current child soldiers as well were there. And we were able to interview them about, here's our strategy. Here's what we were thinking about in London. What do you think about this? And they'd say, well, where's the education part? Or can you buy me out? I have lots of responsibilities, and by being a child soldier, I'm supporting my family. What are you going to do for me economically? And we changed our strategy significantly because we had to actively listen to the people, the young people, small people, but they were people nonetheless, and they should have a right to be able to say what they wanted. So that was one of the lessons, was you have to listen really, really hard. And sometimes it takes you out of your comfort zone to have to go to them and try to listen really hard, and then go back to London and then tell your program coordinators, I'm sorry guys, but the child soldiers of the Moral Islamic Liberation Front don't understand what you're doing for them. They don't get it. They want more economic stuff, and they want something like jobs, and they feel like they're supporting their families. We got to work something else in there. Can we go back to the drawing board and see how we modify this? So one was learning humility. I think a second thing, for me at least, was learning that as an older white man, I had a lot more authority that other people gave me, that even if I didn't try to exercise that, it was still there. So it was a smart human resources director, one of the best we ever had at Transparency International. And I was trying to do an appointment, and there was a personal conflict of the person I wanted to recruit and appoint. I had someone on my recruitment panel. I was the chair, but this other person said, absolutely not, you can't appoint this person. They are not qualified. I don't like them. And I thought it was personal. I overruled them. And the human resources director came back and said, do you understand that you carry a lot of power? That as a white older man, you're going to make the decision, and you just reconfirm in this young woman's mind that you don't give a shit. You go back in, you take an extra week or two, you talk to her about these reservations, you work through it with her, and then you can make your decisions, but she has to be heard. And that was something that was really the value of a good human resources person. There's not a lot of them out there. Sometimes they don't get enough power or authority to be able to make changes. But this guy was able to, I was open enough to it that this guy took me to one side, and I worked with the young woman to say, let's go through your objections. Let's see how we can, how about a training program? How about this or that? Is it personal? It's not personal. Okay, so what about it is it that your experience? And in the end, I did the appointment, and I made not just the personnel decision, but I made a larger team decision that the younger woman not only accepted, but embraced and became part of the support network for the new person to come in and do their job successfully. And it might not have worked out that way, except that I had to take the time and recognize that I could not do what I wanted to do like that. That I had the authority, but just because you have the right to do something doesn't make it right. You have to actually go the further mile and say people have to buy in, and that the perception of it should not confirm stereotypes. So that was the second one. And I guess the third one was working with, I lived and worked in and worked on African issues for a long time. And I knew that I was going to be a two-dimensional cutout for a lot of people. I'd come in as them, not only just white, but also American. So United States role and history in Africa has not been a glorious one anyway, coming in and telling people what to do. So I had to work extra hard to convince people to trust me enough that I would try to do things as best as I could for them and channel what they wanted to say, channeling those voices up so that it wasn't just me doing my job, but it was them using me as a conduit to make some changes happen for them. And that was really quite important in particular to understand that it was not just me and my positional power. It was that there was a lot of hopes riding on what I was going to be doing. So I think that was the third, just contact with creating those relationships that really educated me on what I could do with my power if I could just channel what was the local experience back up the chain to see how I could benefit them by helping resonate or amplify their voices.
In basically all three of those examples, what it is that I hear is it was a lot about listening, about learning to listen deeply, and about, in many ways, reaching out also to the right people and listening to them, and maybe using the power you do have, or the position, the privilege also that you do have to empower those voices and transmit those voices as much as possible. And I find that a really powerful shift of consciousness nearly for people working in NGOs when they start looking for, so connecting to those voices in the end that they are supposed to be helping, you know, and in particular in the first example, I find it so amazing as a consultant or you know, support staff coming in and saying, okay, team, you're putting together a strategy. Who have you spoken to of those people that the strategy is for? The beneficiaries, the end users. Ah, well, but we know them through our contacts, through our...
Bullshit.
Not spoken to anyone. No, but we know from years of experience. Okay, you haven't asked anyone. Go back out and do your homework, you know?
Yeah.
And it's amazing how enthusiastic people get when they start speaking, you know, and hearing, as you say, the child soldier or the person who was tortured in Egypt or the person, and you actually get their inputs and their buy-in to your strategy, then you're getting up and you've got this fire, you know, from, wow, it's not just us with a great idea, it's connected to that real. And I guess for me, the question is always, how has that become so difficult for big NGOs to really be that connected to the ground? What, I mean, from your experience, what is it that happens that gets NGOs sort of looking inwards more and politicking rather than connecting really to those voices and driving themselves based on the accountability to those end users in a way? Or
we were asking me for a quick answer for what we've been working on for 3 months, but I do have my own
summarize
views.
Summarize it.
Headline. I mean, I've lived most of my working life in secretariats. So early on, there was a ECPAT, which was a network in Asia that was set up to stop sex tourism and had child rights and women empowerment. But I can remember very early on in my career seeing that the ECPAT Secretariat in Geneva was dissolved because the membership back out in Asia said, we don't need someone in Geneva lobbying at the UN. Let's bring it home and we'll do it here because we don't need, you guys make 3 times as much money as any of our other people. It's much cheaper and much more efficient if we just do it here and we'll send someone from Bangkok up whenever you want. Forum Asia the same way. That I think there was a number of different NGOs that learned the lesson that the Secretariat was there to serve a movement not the other way around. I think what happens sometimes, I remember mentoring a young coordinator at Transparency International who said, do I really have to work with these other NGOs in this country? They are so unprofessional and they don't send their receipts in on time. And from that experience, I had to say, yes, yes, this is your whole point. This is your raison d'etre, is you're supposed to be working with them and try to support them and trying to, so you don't have to do this anymore, that they can do their own fundraising, so you don't have to receive the receipts. So I think there's the finances, following the money is one thing. If you have to control the money and you have to be responsible for it, and you're very nervous from the CEO on down to the director of finance and the accountants and the program manager who's running the project, you have to make sure that the money is not misspent. There is a question mark over, for people sitting in a northern capital, how best do I control the situation so that nothing goes wrong? And it's the wrong attitude, but that's the incentive that comes up, is we got to control the situation so they don't fuck up out in the field there. And rather to incentivize, let's trust them, let's put in place systems and give them the capacity and support that they can do whatever is needed to control the money and make sure it's well spent. I think that's the issue, is both a matter of trust over money, but also making sure that there's a capacity on the other side. It can get controversial. So the guy who hired me into Transparency International was Peter Eigen, and he went on to create something called the Africa Progress Panel. And that was one of the first times that I heard he had a number of different notable Africans. Mo Ibrahim was there, the cell phone magnate. Kofi Annan, after he retired from being Secretary General, was part of this African Progress Panel. And they were the ones that were saying no to conditionality, yes to the Paris Accord, that you have to give money without having strings attached to it. But there was an other side to it, that you had to make sure that there was enough integrity or anti-corruption systems on the other side, the money was going to be used wisely. And that you wouldn't going to play into the stereotypes of, oh, Africa's a basket case, they're corrupt, they're going to run away with it. That from the African side, they really rallied a lot of good governments to be able to say, yes, we want to make sure we'll have double systems, we'll have good procurement systems. So I think from that experience, at least, I would say money is one of the things that really divides people and gets people worried about how it's spent. And ensuring that both governments as well as NGOs can handle the money properly in an accountable way. It is not onerous, or it's not asking too much to say it's a two-way street, that you have to rise to the responsibilities as well as the rights of getting that money. And the North has to pay that money for both to redeem itself as redress for what has happened in the past, but also that if it's taxpayers' money, they have to demand that it's going to be spent rightly. So it's a balance that has to be done, that both sides have to act with integrity.
Yeah, and I hear also in particular that point that the incentives, when the money is in particular in the North going south, the incentives to trust, to support creating the systems, to allow some mistakes, but we keep supporting, the incentives are rarely there, right? It's much easier in a way to distrust and control, and therefore not really want to work with the least professional, only work with the bigger, I hear that. And
it's a risky thing, yeah.
It is.
You can ask Adrio. I employed Adrio for the first time at TI, Adrio Beschetta, who's in our group. He worked out a great way in which we democratize project management, put it out in the South. The members, these local NGOs, would all be on a board and would run the project themselves. And at the very last minute, the managing director, the top guy, stepped in to cancel the entire management system that had been designed by Adrio in a democratic way. And instead, he took all the money out and put it into a secretariat person based in Europe who was going to sit on all the money and make sure that it was spent properly. And the project did not work out as well as we wanted to, because we did not take that risk. So it's a matter of risk taking as well, to say, I'm going to let go of this and we're going to let this go forward because this is the right thing to do. It might be a risky thing, but it's the right thing to do.
No, it's a really interesting example. And I've unfortunately heard many such examples of, really innovative, also self-organizing, a colleague basically transformed his entire, or the organization he was asked to lead, to be self-organizing. 6 years, hard work, with the team, they were running all by themselves. He said, okay, guys, I'm no longer needed. I'm off. That same day, the board said, okay, back to a manager. We're going to have this run properly.
Wow.
What would you recommend to someone who's coming into this sector or who's been in the sector for a while, who really wants to make this INGO sector healthier, work more effectively, really have more impact, and is struggling at the moment? What would you recommend to them?
For the manager side, I think in change management that I've seen so far, as they try to figure out how to make things better, a couple of things. One is that there's a collective responsibility that has to be fostered. And I'm not talking about going and making beer together or canoeing together. It's more making sure that at the very top that you have rewards. It's not very popular, but this performance-related pay, for example, don't give it individually. You have to give it to the team. Does the team make it? Does the team hit their mark, their performance requirements or not? You try to make a collective responsibility. So it's amazing to see, I've seen it happen before, where people will say, I really want to have at the end of the year, the recognition as well as the small bonus. You're not doing it. You come back in, stop working from home. You get your ass in here and let's work together to make sure this works properly. So there's a collective responsibility. They might not have to like each other, but they have to respect each other and hold each other accountable. So that mutual accountability is one thing. I think the second thing is, for me, increasing the shadow of the expected results. Sometimes you say, we have a 5-year plan. Next year, I'll get to it. I think there's less urgency sometimes that creeps into the work. So that shadow of the future should be looming over everyone to say, no, our first milestone is going to hit in 3 months. We got to work our butts off for this next 3 months to make sure that we can put in place the policy, we can establish that person in Paris, we can get that research done in time for the report to get out at the later date. But it's making sure that there's an urgency or there's an expectation there. I think that's the second thing. And the third, I think, is more devolution of power, that people really want to control their own work. So for me, talking to a manager, a mid-level manager, it's negotiating with your boss above you to say, I'm not going to tell you how this 5,000 is going to be spent. I'm going to give it to the team members and they're going to decide. And you should see them go to town. For 5,000 euros or $5,000, people will get really intense and they'll plan really hard and they'll take it really seriously because it's their 5,000 that they're going to give as a team. It's more important to have that sort of ownership of the resources than for the head director to be able to say, I know where that money is going to be spent, or that certainty. So I think devolving power down, I think the last thing I'd say is to that manager is, it's not a zero-sum game. The more power that you devolve out to the employees and the staff who really need it, who need to have ownership over what they're doing, the more the sum total of power is in an organization, that it increases. It's not that if I give up some power that I have less, it's that everyone has more power. It doesn't have to be competitive in terms of power politics.
Thank you so much for your time, Casey.
You're welcome.
Look forward to speaking soon.
Yep, we'll talk the next session. Nice talking to you.